When a boy who has spent his life in state-run homes turns 18, he expects to be handed a bus ticket and a thin envelope with just enough cash to feel the weight of being alone. He doesn't expect a lawyer. But after my grandfather's will was read, they found me at the Northgate Youth Residence because he left me his entire estate. This is the story of how that inheritance wasn't a gift of money, but a choice that would define the rest of my life. If you've ever felt like you were starting from zero, like the world had already written you off, then this story is for you. Hit that subscribe button if you believe in second chances, because we're going to figure this out together. The day it happened was my 18th birthday. There was no cake, no party, just a meeting with Mr. Henderson, the facility director, in his office that always smelled faintly of stale coffee and disinfectant. He had the same look of practiced sympathy he wore when he had to deliver bad news, which was most of the time. He slid a piece of paper across his metal desk. It was my release form. "Leo," he began, his voice flat, "as of today, you're officially an adult in the eyes of the state. That means our responsibility for you has ended." I just nodded. I'd been preparing for this day for years, hoarding the little bits of advice the older kids passed down like scripture. Get a job within a week. Find a room to rent, even if it's a closet. Don't trust anyone who offers help too easily. The rules of survival were simple and brutal. He pushed a manila envelope next to the form. "There's $200 in there, and a bus pass good for a month. There's also a list of resources, shelters, job placement centers." I looked at the envelope. It felt impossibly thin. $200 wasn't a start. It was a countdown clock to homelessness. "Thank you," I said, "because that's what you did. You said thank you for the bare minimum. You showed gratitude for not being thrown out with literally nothing. It was part of the game." He was about to give me the final, tired speech about making good choices when his phone buzzed. He glanced at it, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face. "Henderson." He listened for a moment, his brow furrowing. "Yes, he's here right now, in my office." Another pause. His eyes darted over to me, and for the first time in the 6 years I'd known him, he looked genuinely surprised. "A lawyer? For him?" He held the phone away from his ear and stared at me as if I'd suddenly grown a second head. "There's a woman at the front desk, a lawyer. She says she needs to speak with you urgently. Something about a probate matter." I had no idea what probate meant. I barely knew what a lawyer did outside of what I'd seen on television. They were for rich people or for criminals. I was neither. "Tell her I'll be right out," Henderson said, hanging up. He stood and straightened his tie, a nervous, reflexive gesture. The power dynamic in the room had shifted, and it made him deeply uncomfortable. Institutions run on predictability. A lawyer was not predictable. "Stay here, Leo." He walked out, leaving the door slightly ajar. I could hear the murmur of his voice, and a woman's, crisp and clear. A few minutes later he returned, followed by a woman who looked as out of place in Northgate as a songbird in a coal mine. She was in her late 40s, maybe, with sharp, intelligent eyes and hair pulled back in a severe bun. She wore a dark gray suit that probably cost more than the entire monthly budget for my wing of the residence. She carried a leather briefcase that looked heavy with importance. She didn't offer a smile, just a direct, appraising gaze. "Leo Vance?" she asked. Her voice was calm and precise. I nodded, my throat suddenly dry. "My name is Catherine Albright. I'm an attorney with the firm Albright and Finch. I was the legal counsel for your late grandfather, Thomas Vance." Grandfather. The word sounded foreign. I had a grandfather, technically, a ghost, a name in a file that I hadn't seen since I was 5 years old. My mother, before she passed, used to talk about him, but her stories were fragmented, broken by grief and illness. He was a farmer, she'd said, a good man, a hard man. And then, one day, he was just gone, vanished. The official story was abandonment. He'd walked out on his family, on his land, on everything. He was the reason my mom and I ended up losing the house, the reason we spiraled down until I landed here. He was the villain of my story. He passed away 2 weeks ago, Ms. Albright continued, pulling a chair up to the desk without asking. She moved with an unnerving efficiency. His will was read yesterday. He named you as his sole heir. Mr. Henderson made a small, choking sound. I just sat there, frozen. The words didn't compute. It was like she was speaking a different language. Heir, will, grandfather. These were concepts from another universe. Heir to what? I finally managed to ask. The question came out as a whisper. His estate, she said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. She opened her briefcase and pulled out a thick file folder. Specifically, a property, 120 acres of land, a farmhouse, and 2 barns in a place called Havenwood. She slid a photograph across the desk. It was an aerial shot, old and faded. A small, white house sat in the middle of a vast checkerboard of green and brown fields, surrounded by dense forest. It looked like a tiny, forgotten island in a sea of trees. I don't understand, I said, shaking my head. The anger I'd buried for 13 years began to stir. He left. He abandoned us. My mother died waiting for him to come back. I've been in places like this my whole life because of him, and now he leaves me a house? The bitterness was a familiar taste in my mouth. It's a bit more complicated than that, Leo, Ms. Albright said, her tone softening just a fraction. It wasn't sympathy, but something closer to professional patience. And that's what we need to discuss. Your inheritance comes with conditions. And a significant problem. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle in the sterile office. Mr. Henderson was leaning against the wall, his mouth slightly agape, forgotten. The property has accrued substantial back taxes over the last 15 years. The total amount owing to the county is $112,000. I laughed. It was a short, harsh sound, completely devoid of humor. 100,000? I've got 200 in an envelope. What am I supposed to do with that? That's the problem, she confirmed, her gaze unwavering. If the taxes aren't paid within 90 days, the county will seize the property and sell it at auction. Furthermore, a development corporation, West Pine Holdings, has been trying to acquire the land for years. They know about the tax lien. They've already submitted a preliminary offer to me as the estate's executor to buy the property from you as is. They'll pay off the taxes and give you a lump sum. She slid another document toward me. It was a letter with the West Pine Holdings logo at the top. I didn't need to read the details. I could feel the predatory energy coming off the paper. How much? I asked, my voice hollow. Their offer is for $750,000, she said. The number hung in the air, sucking all the oxygen out of the room. $750,000. To me, it was an impossible, astronomical figure. It was more than money. It was a different life. It was a clean slate. It was an escape from the future I'd been dreading every single day. After they pay the taxes and my firm's legal fees are settled, you would walk away with a net amount of approximately $600,000. $600,000. I could go anywhere, do anything. I wouldn't have to worry about rent or food or finding a job that paid more than minimum wage. I could be safe. The word echoed in my mind. Safe. I hadn't felt safe since I was 5. So I just sign the paper and I get the money? I asked, my heart pounding. This felt like a dream, a cruel trick. Essentially, yes, Ms. Albright said. It's the most logical course of action. You have no attachment to the property, and you don't have the means to settle the debt. This is a clean break, a fresh start. A fresh start. It was everything I'd ever wanted. But then she pushed one more thing across the desk. It wasn't a document. It was a small, old-fashioned brass key, tarnished with age, attached to a simple leather fob. However, she said slowly, your grandfather left one other item for you. He was very specific in his final instructions. He insisted that before you made any decision, you go to the property yourself. He wanted you to have this. She tapped the key. It opens a lockbox in his study. He said what's inside would explain everything. He wanted you to spend at least one night in the house before you decide to sell it. I stared at the key. It felt heavy, ancient. A key to a house I'd never seen, from a man I only knew as a ghost who had ruined my life. Why would I go there? Why would I want to walk through the rooms of a man I hated? The logical choice was obvious. Take the money, run, never look back. Forget Havenwood, forget the farm, forget Thomas Vance. But I wasn't entirely a product of logic. I was a product of unanswered questions. My entire life was an unanswered question. Why did he leave? Why did my mother get sick? Why was I here? The idea of an explanation, of a reason for the wreckage of my childhood, was a pull stronger than any amount of money. It was a deep, aching need I hadn't even allowed myself to acknowledge until this very moment. The developer's offer is valid for 30 days, Ms. Albright said, her voice pulling me back. They're eager to close. They want to break ground on a new resort complex before winter. A resort. They wanted to bulldoze my grandfather's life and put up a golf course. A strange protective instinct flared inside me, and it was as surprising as it was unwelcome. I'll provide you with a bus ticket to Havenwood and a small stipend from the estate for food, she offered. You can stay there for a few days. Think it over. My number is on my card. Call me when you've made a decision. I looked from the developer's offer letter to the brass key. One was a future, clean and simple, and paid for in cash. The other was a past, messy and painful and locked in a box. The boy who had been raised by the system, the boy who knew how to survive, was screaming at me to take the money. But the small 5-year-old child inside me, the one who still remembered the faint smell of sawdust and soil on an old man's coat, whispered a different word. Go. I reached out, my fingers closing around the cold metal of the key. Okay, I said, my voice barely audible. I'll go. Ms. Albright gave a single, sharp nod, as if she'd expected this all along. She saw it not as an emotional choice, but as a necessary procedural step. A box to be ticked on the way to the inevitable signature. Perhaps she was right. Perhaps I was just delaying the obvious, indulging in one last piece of dramatic nonsense before accepting my golden ticket out of the life I knew. But as I clutched that key in my hand, the first real choice I had ever made as a free man, it felt like anything but nonsense. It felt like the beginning of a story I had to see through to the end, no matter what it cost me. The bus ride to Havenwood was a slow, rattling journey out of one world and into another. The city, with its concrete canyons and relentless noise, gradually gave way to sprawling suburbs, then to patchwork fields and forgotten little towns that seemed to be actively fading into the landscape. For hours, I just stared out the window, watching the world I knew dissolve behind me. Northgate had been a cage, but it was a familiar one. I knew its rhythms, its dangers, its unspoken rules. Out here, on this bus, I was nothing. Just a kid with a backpack containing one change of clothes, a toothbrush, and a key to a life that wasn't mine. I had refused Mr. Henderson's $200. It felt like a point of pride, a small act of defiance. Mrs. Albright had given me a prepaid debit card with $500 on it, an advance from the estate. It felt like a fortune and nothing at all, simultaneously. The other passengers were a quiet mix of working people and the elderly. A woman across the aisle was knitting a bright yellow scarf, her needles clicking in a steady, comforting rhythm. An old man in front of me was asleep, his head resting against the vibrating window pane. No one looked at me. No one cared who I was or where I was going. In the system, you were always being watched, evaluated, judged. Here, the anonymity was so complete it was almost dizzying. It was freedom, but it was a cold, sharp-edged kind of freedom. After 3 hours, the bus pulled into Havenwood. It wasn't so much a town as a suggestion of one. There was a single main street with a post office, a general store with a rusted tin roof, a diner with a flickering neon sign that read, "Eat," and a gas station with pumps that looked like they were from a museum. That was it. The rest was just quiet houses and roads that disappeared into the thick, dark woods that pressed in on all sides. The bus hissed to a stop in front of the general store. I was the only one who got off. The driver gave me a curious look as he handed me my backpack from the storage compartment below. "You sure this is your stop, son?" he asked, his voice gravelly. "Yeah," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "I'm sure." He shrugged, climbed back into the bus, and pulled away, leaving me alone in a cloud of diesel fumes on the side of the road. The silence that descended was absolute. It wasn't the absence of noise, like in a soundproof room. It was a different kind of sound, the rustle of leaves in a light breeze, the distant caw of a crow, the low hum of a refrigerator from inside the store. It was the sound of a world that moved at a different speed. I had the address Ms. Albright had given me written on a piece of paper in my pocket. 1414 Black Creek Road. I walked into the general store. The bell above the door chimed softly. An old woman with a cloud of white hair sat behind the counter, reading a newspaper. She looked up at me over her glasses. "Help you?" she asked. Her voice was surprisingly strong. "I'm looking for a taxi," I said. She let out a short, dry laugh. "Honey, you're looking at the only store, post office, and information desk in a 10-mile radius. We ain't had a taxi service here since ever. Where you trying to get to?" 1414 Black Creek Road, I said. Her expression changed. The friendly, small-town curiosity sharpened into something else, something cautious. "The old Vance place," she said, her voice dropping a little. She folded her newspaper carefully and placed it on the counter. "No one's been out there in years, not since Tom left." She didn't look at me, but at something over my shoulder, a memory in the middle distance. "He was my grandfather," I said quietly. Now she looked at me. Her eyes, pale blue and watery, scanned my face, searching for a resemblance. "Well, I'll be," she murmured, You've got his eyes. She seemed to make a decision. Place is a good 4 miles out of town. It's a long walk with a bag. She leaned over the counter and called toward the back of the store. Earl, get out here. A moment later, a man who was her mirror image in male form, stooped and weathered, came shuffling out from a back room, wiping his hands on a greasy rag. What is it, Martha? This boy needs a ride out to the old Vance place. He's Tom's grandson. Earl looked me up and down, his expression unreadable. Is that so? He grunted. He didn't seem thrilled. Road's probably half washed out after the storm last week. He'll pay you for your gas, Martha said, giving him a pointed look. Earl sighed, a long, weary sound of resignation. All right, fine. Truck's out back. Let's go. I followed him out behind the store to an ancient, rust-eaten Ford pickup. The passenger door groaned in protest as I opened it. The cab smelled of oil, dirt, and something vaguely like wet dog. We drove in silence for a few minutes, the truck rattling and clanking down the paved main street until Earl turned onto a gravel road marked with a faded wooden sign, Black Creek Road. The road got rougher, the trees closing in around us until their branches scraped against the sides of the truck. The world grew darker, dappled with the little bits of sunlight that managed to pierce the thick canopy. So you're Tom's boy, Earl finally said, not looking at me. Grandson, I corrected. Right. Heard he passed. Sorry for your loss. It was a rote phrase, said without any real feeling. I didn't know him, I said. He left when I was a kid. Yeah, we all heard that, Earl said, a certain edge to his voice. He seemed to be choosing his words carefully. Folks around here had different ideas about what happened. Tom Vance wasn't the sort of man to just walk away from his land. That farm was his whole world. This was the second time someone had hinted that the official story wasn't the whole story. First Ms. Albright, now this stranger. It was a crack in the foundation of the simple narrative I'd built my anger on. We rounded a sharp bend, and the trees suddenly fell away. Before us lay a wide, overgrown meadow, and in the center of it, just like in the photograph, was the house. It was worse than I had imagined. The white paint was peeling away in long strips, revealing the weathered gray wood beneath. The porch roof sagged dangerously in the middle, and several windows on the second floor were boarded up. A massive oak tree stood beside it, one of its heavy limbs resting on the roof of the house as if it were a weary arm. The two barns behind it were in even worse shape, their roofs caved in places. The whole place looked like it was slowly being swallowed by the wilderness. It didn't look like a home. It looked like a grave. Earl pulled the truck to a stop where the gravel drive dissolved into weeds. This is it, he said. End of the line. I got out and stood there, my backpack feeling flimsy and inadequate. The sheer scale of the neglect was overwhelming. This wasn't a fixer-upper. This was a ruin. Thanks for the ride, I said, pulling the debit card from my pocket. How much do I owe you? He waved a dismissive hand. Forget it, kid. Call it a welcome home present, I guess. He looked at the house, a sad, knowing look in his eyes. Place has good bones, though. Tom built it to last. Just needs a lot of work. He put the truck in reverse. You got a phone? Cell service is spotty out here. Yeah, I've got one. All right. Well, good luck, kid. He backed the truck up, turned it around in a tight, difficult circle, and drove away, leaving me once again in that profound, ringing silence. I was completely alone. I looked at the house, at the sagging porch and the boarded windows. My grandfather had wanted me to spend a night here. It seemed like a cruel joke. The place looked like it might collapse if I sneezed too hard. I walked up the overgrown path to the front porch. The wooden steps groaned under my weight, but they held. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth, decaying leaves, and something else, the faint, sweet scent of honeysuckle. A vine had crawled its way up one of the porch columns, its small white flowers a tiny spot of life in the midst of all the decay. I reached the front door. The paint was cracked and blistered, but the wood itself was solid oak. The keyhole was dark and forbidding. I took a deep breath, pulled the brass key from my pocket, and slid it into the lock. It turned with a rusty, grating sound, and the latch clicked open with a loud thud that echoed in the quiet air. I pushed the door open. It swung inward on silent, well-oiled hinges, a strange and startling detail in a house so thoroughly neglected. The air that flowed out from inside was cool and musty, carrying the scent of dust, old paper, and time itself. I stepped across the threshold, and the door swung shut behind me, plunging me into a world of shadows and whispers. The entryway was dark, the only light coming from the dusty fanlight above the door. A grand staircase rose up in front of me, its banister thick with cobwebs. To my left was an archway leading into what looked like a living room, and to my right, a closed door. Everything was covered in a thick, uniform layer of dust, a gray shroud that softened every edge and muted every color. It was like a photograph from 100 years ago. But despite the dust and the gloom, it was clear this had once been a beautiful house. The floors were wide planks of dark wood, the ceilings were high, and there was a sense of solid, handcrafted quality to everything. It didn't feel like a ruin from the inside. It felt like a place that was sleeping. I dropped my backpack in the hall and moved toward the living room. The furniture was still there, draped in white cloths like pale ghosts. A huge stone fireplace dominated one wall, big enough to stand in. I ran my hand along the back of a sofa, leaving a clean streak in the thick dust. Underneath the sheet, the fabric was a deep, rich blue. This wasn't the home of a man who had planned to walk away. This was the home of a man who expected to come back. I crossed the hall to the closed door on the right. This had to be the study Ms. Albright mentioned. The doorknob was cold and stiff, but it turned. The room was smaller than the living room, lined from floor to ceiling with empty bookshelves. A large, heavy desk sat in the center of the room, facing the window. And on the desk, sitting right in the middle, was a metal lockbox. It was an old military-style ammunition box, painted dark green. It wasn't large, but it looked heavy, solid. It had a heavy-duty hasp, secured with a small, sturdy padlock. I walked over to the desk, my footsteps unnaturally loud in the silent house. My heart was hammering against my ribs. This was it, the reason I was here, the explanation my grandfather had promised me. I pulled the key from my pocket. It was too big for this padlock. I frowned, my stomach sinking with disappointment. Had I come all this way for nothing? Was this some kind of sick joke? I tried the key in the desk drawers. They were all unlocked, but they were all empty. I looked around the room, a frantic energy building inside me. Where was the lock this key was for? I ran my hands along the bookshelves, tapping the walls, searching for a hidden panel, a loose board, anything. Nothing. Defeated, I sank into the dusty chair behind the desk. The leather cracked in protest. My eyes fell back to the lockbox. Maybe the key wasn't for the box itself. Maybe it was for something that held the key to the box. My gaze drifted around the room again, slower this time. I looked at the empty shelves, the dusty floor, the window overlooking the overgrown front yard. Then I looked at the desk itself. It was a huge, solid piece of oak, a partner desk with drawers on both sides. I had only checked the drawers on my side. I walked around to the other side. The drawers were all unlocked. I pulled them open, one by one. Empty, empty, empty. Then, in the bottom right drawer, my fingers brushed against something taped to the very back of the drawer's interior. I had to get down on my hands and knees and reach all the way in. It was a small, flat key, the kind you might use for a diary or a small padlock. My breath caught. I scrambled back to my feet and hurried back to the lockbox. With a trembling hand, I inserted the tiny key into the padlock. It fit perfectly. I turned it, and the lock clicked open. For a moment, I just stood there, staring at it. The big, heavy brass key I'd been given had been a misdirection, a test. It had opened the front door, yes, but its real purpose was to make me think, to make me search. It was the first part of a puzzle. I lifted the hasp and slowly, carefully, raised the heavy lid of the box. Inside there was no treasure, no stacks of money, no gold, no jewels. There was just a single, thick, sealed envelope made of heavy manila paper, and a small handheld cassette recorder, the kind reporters used in old movies. On the envelope, written in a strong, slightly slanted hand, was one word: Leo. This was it, the story, the truth. I picked up the envelope. It felt heavy, dense with words. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely hold it steady. I didn't know if I was ready to read it. I didn't know if I wanted the ghost of Thomas Vance to finally have a voice. What if it was just excuses? What if it was a confession of his weakness, his failure? Part of me wanted to close the box, walk out of the house, call Ms. Albright, and take the money. It was the safe choice, the logical path. But I knew I couldn't. 13 years of silence had led to this moment, to this room, to this envelope. I had to know. I sat down in the dusty desk chair, the lockbox open before me like a wound. I took a deep breath, the air thick with the smell of old paper and secrets. Then I broke the seal. Inside the envelope were not loose pages, but a single leather-bound journal. It was worn, the corners soft with use. I opened it to the first page. The handwriting was the same as on the envelope, neat and controlled. The first entry was dated almost exactly 13 years ago, just a few weeks after he had supposedly disappeared. It began with 2 words that hit me like a physical blow. My dearest Leo. I started to read, and the silent, dusty house began to fill with the voice of the man I had never known. The journal wasn't a chronological account of his life. It was a letter. A single, sprawling, book-length letter to me. He started by talking about my mother, his daughter, Sarah. He wrote about her birth, about how small she was, about the fierce, terrifying love he felt for her. He wrote about her laugh, about the way she used to chase fireflies in the fields behind the house. He painted a picture of a life I had never known, a life filled with warmth and light and family, a life on this farm. He described the house not as the ruin I saw, but as a living thing. He'd built most of it himself with his own father, felling the trees from their own land, milling the wood in the old barn. Every board, every nail had a story. This wasn't just property to him, it was his history, his legacy. Then, the tone began to shift. He wrote about the year before he vanished. A bad harvest, followed by a brutal winter. My grandmother, his wife, had gotten sick, and the medical bills piled up faster than snowdrifts. He took out a loan, not from a bank, but from a man in a town a few counties over. A man who was known for lending money to farmers when no one else would. The interest rates were criminal, but he was desperate. He thought he could handle it. One good harvest was all he needed. But the good harvest never came. The debt doubled, then tripled. The man he'd borrowed from wasn't just a loan shark. He was connected. He was part of a network that preyed on people like my grandfather. They didn't just want their money back. They wanted leverage. They wanted his land. They started making threats, first veiled, then explicit. They talked about my mother. They talked about me, a 5-year-old boy. The words on the page grew tighter, the handwriting more tense. He wrote, "I looked at your mother, and I looked at you, and I saw the two things in the world I couldn't bear to lose. The land, the house. It was just wood and dirt. But you two, you were my heart. And they were threatening my heart." He realized he couldn't fight them, and he couldn't pay them, not in the conventional way. So he made a deal. It was a devil's bargain. He would sign over a deed of trust on the farm, not to them directly, but to a holding company they controlled. And he would go to work for them. He had skills. He was a good mechanic, good with his hands, good at disappearing. He would work off the debt, however long it took. The condition was that he had to disappear completely. He had to cut all ties, no phone calls, no letters. He had to let everyone, including his own daughter, believe he had abandoned them. It was the only way to ensure they wouldn't come after her, after me. He was trading his life for ours. "It was the hardest decision I ever made, Leo," he wrote. "To walk away from your mother, to know she would think I had abandoned her, was a pain worse than death. I had to become the villain in her story, to keep her safe. I hoped one day I would be able to come back and explain. But life doesn't always give you the time you think you have." He wrote about my mother's death. He'd found out from a distance, through a third party. He couldn't come to the funeral. He couldn't comfort her. He couldn't be there when I was taken into the system. He described standing on a hill miles away, watching the small procession at the local cemetery, a ghost at his own daughter's burial. My hands were shaking. I had to put the journal down. Tears were blurring the words. All the anger, all the hatred I had carried for him for 13 years was dissolving, replaced by a wave of grief so profound it felt like I was drowning. He hadn't abandoned us. He had sacrificed himself for us. My entire identity, the story of the abandoned boy, was built on a lie. A lie he had constructed to protect me. I sat there in the silent study for what felt like hours, the weight of his words pressing down on me. I cried. I cried for the grandfather I never knew, for the sacrifice he'd made. I cried for my mother, who had died believing she was unloved by her own father. And I cried for the boy who had grown up in the cold, sterile world of institutions, believing he came from a line of people who left. Okay, I need to pause here. This was the moment the ground fell out from under me. Everything I thought was true about my life, about my family, was wrong. It was like learning the sky wasn't blue. If you've ever had a moment like that, a moment where a single truth just shatters your entire world, I want you to know you're not alone. It's a terrifying, disorienting feeling. Let me know in the comments if you've ever had to rebuild your own story from scratch. This community we're building here, it's for people who get it, for people who have had to find their own truth. Now, let's get back to that house, because the story wasn't over. Not by a long shot. After a while, I picked up the journal again. My eyes were raw, but I had to know the rest. He explained that he'd spent the next decade working in the shadows for these people. He worked as a mechanic in a chop shop, a long-haul trucker moving things he knew he shouldn't ask about, a handyman on properties they owned. He was a ghost, living in cheap motels, always looking over his shoulder. He never touched a bank account. He lived in cash. And every spare dollar he made, he saved. He stuffed it into coffee cans, into old boots, into the hollowed-out books he kept in storage lockers across 3 states. He was saving it for one purpose: to pay the back taxes on the farm. He knew the debt he owed the criminals was illegitimate, a phantom number they could inflate forever. He would never be free of them. But the debt to the county was real. That was the one thing that could make the farm truly belong to someone else. He wrote, "I knew I was dying, Leo. The doctor told me I had a year, maybe less. So I started to make my final move. I couldn't get the land back in my name. That would have put you in danger. But I could leave it to you, the last of the Vance line." He explained that he had spent the last year of his life slowly, carefully moving his savings. He brought it all back here, to this house, in the dead of night. He hid it. "I couldn't just give you the money," he wrote. "If you suddenly came into a large sum of cash, it would raise questions. And worse, it would make you a target for the same people I've spent my life hiding from. West Pine Holdings, the developer who wants the land? They're not just a developer, Leo. They're a clean face for the same network I got tangled up with. They launder money through real estate. They don't take no for an answer. Selling to them would make you rich, yes, but you'd be taking their money. You'd be in their world. And that's the last thing on earth I ever wanted for you." My blood ran cold. West Pine Holdings. Ms. Albright had presented them as a simple, logical solution, a clean exit. But they were the villains of the story. Taking their money wasn't an escape. It was walking right back into the cage my grandfather had died to get me out of. The journal was coming to an end. The last few pages were written in a shakier hand. "So I've left you with a choice, son. It's not a fair choice, but it's the only one I can give you. In this house, hidden away, is $150,000 in cash. It's more than enough to pay the back taxes and have a little left over to start with. You can use it to save this place, to make it your own. It will be hard. The house needs work. The land needs tending. You'll be on your own, but you'll be free. Truly free. Or," he continued, "you can take their offer. You can sign the papers, take the $600,000 and disappear. I wouldn't blame you if you did. God knows you deserve an easy life after the one you've had. It's clean money in the eyes of the law. You could go anywhere, be anyone. No one would ever have to know where it came from. It's the safe path, in a way. But it's not the free one." The final page had only a few sentences. "The money is in the heart of the house, where the warmth comes from. I love you, Leo. I'm sorry for everything. Make it a home. Your home." He was gone. The letter was over. I closed the journal, my mind reeling. The choice was so much bigger than I had thought. It wasn't just about a dilapidated house versus a pile of cash. It was about his sacrifice. It was about honoring his memory versus taking blood money from the people who had destroyed his life. It was about choosing a hard, honest freedom over an easy, compromised safety. But first, I had to find the money. The heart of the house, where the warmth comes from. My first thought was the fireplace in the living room. It was massive, the literal heart of the main floor. I spent the next hour on my hands and knees, tapping every stone, every brick. I swept out decades of soot and ash, my hands turning black. I checked for loose stones, for a hollow space behind the firebox. Nothing. It was solid stone. I sat back on the dusty floor, frustrated. What else could it mean? The warmth? The furnace? I found the basement door under the main staircase. Using the flashlight on my phone, I descended into a damp, stone-walled cellar. The furnace was a huge, octopus-like machine, ancient and silent. I spent another hour examining it, tapping the ductwork, looking for any signs of tampering. Again, nothing. It was just an old furnace. I was exhausted, covered in dust and soot. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, distorted shadows through the grimy windows. The house was getting colder. I went back to the study and reread the last page of the journal. The heart of the house, where the warmth comes from. It was a riddle. My grandfather, the man who had created the puzzle with the key, had left me one final test. I thought about the house. I thought about the way he described it, the way he'd built it. It was more than a structure to him. It was a living thing. I walked through the downstairs rooms again, this time trying to see them through his eyes. The living room, the dining room, the small, simple kitchen at the back. The kitchen was the most dilapidated room of all. The linoleum on the floor was cracked and peeling, and the counters were water-damaged. But in the center of the kitchen was something I hadn't paid much attention to before. A huge cast-iron wood-burning stove. It wasn't for heating the house, like the furnace. It was a cook stove. It had a firebox for wood, a flat top for cooking, and an oven for baking. In an old farmhouse like this, the kitchen was the center of life. It was where the family gathered. It was where the food was made. It was, in a very real sense, where the warmth came from. My heart started to beat faster. I ran my hands over the cold iron of the stove. It was massive, probably weighing half a ton. I opened the firebox. It was full of old, charred wood. I pulled it all out. Nothing. I opened the oven door. It was empty, just a rusty metal box. I looked for panels, for seams, for anything that looked like it could be opened. Then I noticed it. On the side of the stove, near the floor, was a small, hinged door about the size of my hand. It was an ash clean-out door. It was rusted shut. I ran back to the entryway, grabbed a tire iron I'd seen in a pile of old tools near the door, and came back. I wedged the end of the tire iron under the edge of the small door and pried. The metal groaned in protest. I put all my weight into it, and with a loud crack, the rusted hinge gave way. The door popped open. It wasn't a shallow ash pit. It was a deep, hollow cavity. And inside, wrapped in oilcloth and packed tightly together, were dozens of bundles of cash. I reached in with a trembling hand and pulled one out. It was a stack of $100 bills, bound with a simple rubber band. I pulled out another and another. They were all the same. Coffee cans, old boots, hollowed-out books. It was all here. The sum of his secret, lonely life. His last gift to me. I piled the bundles on the dusty kitchen table. I didn't count it right away. I just sat there, staring at it. It was real. The story was real. The choice was real. This pile of worn, faded bills was my grandfather's entire life, his pain, his hope, all distilled into a single, tangible thing. And it was my responsibility now. The weight of it was immense. I finally counted it. It took a long time. When I was done, the total was $152,460. More than enough. The sun had set completely now. The house was pitch black and silent, save for the sound of my own breathing. I wasn't scared. For the first time since I'd arrived, the house didn't feel like a ruin or a grave. It felt like a sanctuary. I had found its heart. I spent the night not in one of the dusty bedrooms, but on the floor of the study with my grandfather's journal and the lockbox. I didn't sleep. I just thought. I weighed the two futures in my hands. The first future was easy. I could call Ms. Albright in the morning, tell her I'd accept West Pine's offer. I'd wire her the money for the taxes, and she could handle the closing. Within a month, I'd have over $500,000 in my bank account. I could buy a car, an apartment in some city where no one knew my name. I could go to college without worrying about debt. I could travel. I could live a life of comfort and ease, a life I couldn't have even dreamed of 2 days ago. It was a seductive thought. It was the smart move. It was what any rational person would do. The second future was a sheer cliff face. I could use the money to pay the taxes. That would leave me with about $40,000. Enough to live on for a while, enough to buy some tools and materials. But I'd have this wreck of a house, 120 acres of wild land, and no skills to manage any of it. I didn't know how to fix a roof, how to plow a field, how to even begin to turn this place back into a home. And what's more, I'd be making an enemy of West Pine Holdings. My grandfather's letter had made it clear who they were. They weren't a company that would just walk away. They would see me as an obstacle. I'd be alone, on this isolated piece of land, with powerful, dangerous people knowing I was here. It was a terrifying prospect. It was the stupid move. It was what no rational person would do. I thought about the system that had raised me. It was a system built on logic, on risk assessment, on moving people through like they were parts on an assembly line. The logical choice was always the safe choice, the one with the least resistance. My entire life had been about following that path. Don't make waves. Don't stand out. Just get through it. Taking the developer's money was a continuation of that thinking. It was the ultimate safe play. But my grandfather hadn't taken the safe play. He'd made a choice that was illogical, painful, and impossibly hard, all for the sake of love. He had given up everything to give me a chance at a different kind of life. A life of meaning, of connection to a place. A life where I owned something that couldn't be taken away. He hadn't just left me land and money. He had left me his story. Selling the farm would be like tearing out the last page. It would be erasing him all over again. Morning came, painting the dusty windows with pale gray light. I had made my decision. My phone had 1 bar of service, flickering in and out. I had to walk out to the middle of the front yard and hold it up in the air to get a steady signal. I dialed the number on Ms. Albright's card. She answered on the second ring, her voice as crisp as ever. "Catherine Albright?" "Ms. Albright, it's Leo Vance." "Leo, I was expecting your call. Have you had a chance to think things over? I have the paperwork from West Pine ready to be sent over for your signature." "I've thought about it," I said, my voice steady. I looked back at the house. In the morning light, it looked less like a ruin and more like a promise. It was battered and broken, but it was still standing, just like me. "I'm not selling." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. For the first time, I had managed to surprise her. "Leo," she said slowly, her professional calm strained. Let's be realistic. You can't afford the taxes. This offer is the only viable option. I can afford the taxes, I said. I'm going to wire you $113,000 today for the back taxes and to retain you as my lawyer. I want you to file the payment with the county immediately, and I want you to inform West Pine Holdings that their offer has been rejected. The property is not for sale. Another silence, this one longer, heavier. I could almost hear the calculations running in her head. She was a lawyer. She dealt in facts and evidence. An 18-year-old kid from a group home doesn't just magically produce over $100,000. "Leo, where did you get that kind of money?" she asked, her voice low and cautious. This was the dangerous part. The truth was too complicated, too risky to tell over the phone. "My grandfather was a very resourceful man," I said, choosing my words carefully. "He made provisions. The money is legitimate. It's my inheritance, same as the land. He just delivered it in a different way." I was banking on her professional discretion. As my lawyer, her primary duty was to me, her client. As long as the money wasn't from an obvious criminal enterprise, she was obligated to follow my instructions. "I see," she said, though I knew she didn't. But I could hear the shift in her tone. She was moving from seeing me as a child to be managed, to a client to be represented. "This is highly irregular, Leo, and I have to advise you, turning down West Pine's offer could have repercussions. They are a very persistent company." "I know," I said. "My grandfather explained that to me. But this is my decision." "Very well," she said, her voice all business again. "I will email you the wire transfer instructions. Once the funds are received, I will file the necessary paperwork with the county tax assessor and formally reject West Pine's offer. What are your plans now?" I looked around at the overgrown fields, at the forest looming in the distance, at the sagging roof of the house. I had no plan, not really, just a starting point. "I'm staying here," I said. "I'm home." After the call, a strange sense of peace settled over me. The choice was made, the die was cast. The consequences would come, but for now, there was just the work. I spent the rest of the day taking stock. I made a list. It was a very long list. Fix the roof, clear the fields, repair the barns, get the water and electricity turned back on. Learn how to do everything. It was overwhelming, but it wasn't discouraging. Every item on that list was a step toward building something real. A few days later, Earl from the general store showed up in his rattling pickup truck. He didn't say much. He just got out, carrying an old chainsaw. "Heard you were staying," he said, pulling the starter cord. The chainsaw roared to life. "Figured you could use a hand with that tree on your roof." He spent the entire day with me, expertly cutting the massive limb into manageable sections, showing me how to work the saw safely. He never asked where the money for the taxes came from. He never asked what my plans were. He just helped. When we were done, and the damaged section of the roof was finally exposed to the sky, he stood back, wiping sweat from his forehead. "My dad and your granddad used to help each other out like this all the time," he said. "It's just what neighbors do." It was the beginning. Other people started to appear. Martha, Earl's sister, dropped off a box of fresh vegetables and a loaf of homemade bread. A retired carpenter named Mr. Gable stopped by and spent an afternoon showing me how to assess the structural damage to the porch. He left me with a list of tools I'd need and promised to come back. I learned that my grandfather hadn't just been a farmer. He had been a part of this community. And by choosing to stay, by choosing to honor his legacy, I was slowly, tentatively, being welcomed into it. The work was brutal. I was sore in muscles I didn't know I had. Every day was a new problem, a new challenge I was completely unprepared for. There were days I sat on the porch, staring at the enormity of the task, and felt a crushing wave of despair. The temptation of that other life, the easy life, would whisper in my ear. But then I would open my grandfather's journal, or I would hold the old brass key in my hand, and I would remember why I was doing this. I wasn't just fixing a house, I was rebuilding a life, my life, on my own terms. One day, a sleek black car I didn't recognize drove up the gravel road. A man in an expensive suit got out. He was from West Pine Holdings. He didn't threaten me. He was smooth, charming. He said their offer was still on the table. In fact, they were prepared to increase it to $1 million. A clean $1 million. He laid it all out, the life of ease I could have. He was selling a dream. I listened patiently. When he was done, I just shook my head. "The property isn't for sale," I said. He smiled, a thin, cold smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Everything is for sale, son. It's just a matter of finding the right price. We'll be in touch." He got back in his car and drove away. I knew it wasn't the end. They would be back. The system, the pressure, the easy way out, it never really goes away. It's always there, waiting for you to get tired. But as I watched his car disappear, I wasn't afraid. I was determined. I turned back to the house. There was a section of the roof that needed patching before the next rain. I had the tools. I had the materials. And I had the time. So that's where my story is right now. I'm still here. The house is still standing. The work is still hard, and the future is still uncertain. But for the first time in my life, I feel like I belong somewhere. This land, this house, this history, it's mine. Not because it was given to me, but because I chose it. My grandfather's inheritance wasn't the farm, it wasn't the money, it was the choice. The choice between an easy life and a meaningful one. And I choose this. I choose the struggle, the work, the history. I choose to build a home. What this whole journey has taught me is that the most valuable things we inherit aren't material. They're the stories, the sacrifices, and the strength of the people who came before us. Home isn't just a place you live. It's a story you decide to be a part of. It's the harder right over the easier wrong. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever had to make a choice that defined who you are, please subscribe to the channel and join our community. And I want you to do me a favor. In the comments below, tell me what home means to you. Is it a place, a person, a memory, a choice? I promise you, I will read every single one of your stories. Because we're all just trying to find our way back to a place that feels like it's ours. Thank you for listening.